Welcome at this session of the history and methodology of economics. And this time the topic are the new Keynesian DSG model, which is the attempt to bring together the Keynesian macroeconomics with micro foundations and rational expectations, which were the main novelties introduced by the theories of equilibrium business cycles in 1970s. Here's the outline. We'll talk about the new Keynesian macroeconomics and the features of the current mainstream here. And we'll talk about the implications of the new Keynesian macroeconomics for fiscal policy, as the new Keynesian macroeconomics, as it's been developed over the 1980s and 1990s, contributed to unprecedented consensus among macroeconomists in the question how macroeconomics shall be done, and also it led to rather broad consensus about what is the appropriate macroeconomic policy. However, there were several aspects which remained controversial and where the consensus hasn't been reached. And one of those is of fiscal policy. And the discussions about fiscal policy, especially during the Great Recession, allow us to reveal or to discuss several weaknesses and several aspects of the new Keynesian macroeconomics that haven't been understood much before. We'll also discuss here and also then in the class, based on the readings, the problem of expansionary fiscal consolidation, and then we return to the discussion to what extent is the progress in economics driven by scientific progress, and what is the role of ideology there. The new Keynesian macroeconomics appeared as a reaction to the developments in macroeconomics in the 1970s and then in the early 1980s. These decades have brought a new generation of macroeconomic models, which replaced the former framework of behavioral equations based on ISLM and aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And a new generation of macroeconomic models was based on micro foundations and rational expectations. That means they were based on the assumption that the behavior of households and firms can be organized or can be optimized, that general equilibrium exists, and that the general equilibrium is the appropriate starting point for the analysis of behavior, not only on the micro level, but also on the macro level, because the optimal allocations just evolve over time, but still can evolve over time Pareto efficiently. Those equilibrium business cycles models represented a very large progress in terms of methodology. However, the first generations of models had substantial flaws. First of all, the monetary cycle model developed by Robert Lucas required a very ad hoc assumption of monetary illusion, which wasn't really realistic. The second generation of the equilibrium business cycles, the real business cycles, on the other hand, relied on unobserved technology shocks, which, however, would have to be quite frequent, quite large, to lead to cycles. Now, besides that, we would need to know and understand better what can be, for example, negative technology shocks, and to allow also to relative frequent occurrence of not only of positive technology shocks, but also negative technology shocks as well. So this aspect, the reliance on technology shock, wasn't very, very realistic either. And also the policy implications of the real business cycles were not unanimously accepted. They were quite controversial because they had no room, had left no room for monetary policy, and monetary policy was considered to be neutral in those models, which wasn't really in line with the experience of many economists with applied policy making, not only in the US but also elsewhere. These shortcomings led to a development of a new framework that started mainly as a response of a younger generation of Keynesian economists who were willing to keep the room for policy, for monetary and fiscal policy, for both of them in macroeconomic models, but to reflect the changes in the economic theory in 1970s. So, like in the new classical macroeconomics, the new models started to be based on micro foundations. So, again, households and firms have rational expectations there, and their behavior is expected to be consistent with dynamic optimization. On the other hand, like the old Keynesians, these economists share the belief that market failures exist and that the market allocations is not always optimal. Why? Because there are some barriers in adjustment called rigidities. Two types of rigidities were discussed by the proponents of the models and of those theories and included in the main macroeconomic in the macroeconomic models. These were first the real rigidities, like imperfect competition and labor market imperfections, and then the nominal rigidities, like sticky prices and staggered price adjustment, which means that there is no fast adjustment to changes, to shocks and to other changes in economic environment. This implies that the reactions to shocks might not be optimal, which is in stark opposition towards the implications derived from the real business cycle models. Moreover, the adjustment towards the optimal trajectories takes time, and so the economy might fail quite often to attain the full equilibrium, the full employment. And therefore, there is a room for policy. Let me summarize now the main elements of this new synthesis. First, there is intertemporal optimization in the model embedded. So, so the approach of dynamic equilibrium is retained. Second, households and firms are assumed to have rational expectations. Third, imperfect competition is supposed to characterize the firm sector. That means firms are able to set their prices. They are not only price receivers. They have some monopoly power, and they are able to influence their prices. This was important because then it was allowed, this assumption allowed to think about the staggered price adjustment and allowed to think about prices that do not adjust instantaneously. Second, the price adjustment is supposed to be costly. So there are several reasons why the adjustment can be costly. One of them is associated with the so-called menu costs. That once some menus are written and catalogs are written, then it takes time until they can be rewritten. Obviously, this is not that much relevant, perhaps today when pricing is done online for many goods and allow really fast changes. But one also needs to consider as a specific form that all the contracts are usually signed for some period and they need to be renegotiated, which creates some additional costs as well. The fifth assumption is that the economy is supposed to have natural pro-rate property, which means that like with the equilibrium business cycle models, it is assumed that there are some steady states to which the economy converges after some shock. Also, this natural rate property implies that even if any shock appears, it's likely to have temporary impact only, and there are no permanent effects are allowed in those models. And the final element which needs to be highlighted is the so-called efficient market hypothesis. The efficient market hypothesis has been developed in the gradually, especially in the 1960s, and the efficient market hypothesis, which I will describe in this video a bit later, implies that there is no need and no room for financial regulation, because, also saying, markets and financial markets in particular are able to achieve optimal allocation. So while we need some interventions on the goods market and on labor markets and so on, the financial markets are different. They are supposed to be very, very effective. The idea was quite similar. There were no apparent equivalence there is no apparent equivalent to staggered price adjustment or menu costs on financial markets, where the pricing is instantaneous. The main proponents of the new Keynesian macroeconomics are stars of today's economics. So and no matter some of them. Actually, some of them are maybe maybe more on the right wing. Some of them are mainly perhaps more on the left wing of political spectra, but still they still share very similar view on what are the right macroeconomic models. So John Taylor, Stanley Fischer, George Akerlof, and Janet Yellen. Also Joseph Stiglitz and Gregory Menke, Olivier Blanchard, David Romer, and Richard Clarida, Michael Woodford, Mark Geltler, and many others. Perhaps the main difference perhaps the first difference which can be observed just at the first sight when looking at the new Keynesian macroeconomic models is that these models do not rely on one universal cause of business cycles. Rather, they accept the idea that there might be many alternative causes of business cycles. All those causes can lead to slightly different dynamics. And so the proper model of economic cycles shall, according to the proponents of those theories, allow for a multitude of of shocks that hit the economy. So the framework of the new Keynesian, of the so-called new Keynesian dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, very often abbreviated as NK-DSGE or simply DSGE, can be easily extended for various blocks and for different shocks, which are believed to be more important perhaps than the others. So monetary policy shocks appear there. There can appear also technology shocks. There can appear shocks into expectations, shock into inflation target, whatever. So everyone has a freedom to develop a model with the shocks which are considered to be important by the researcher, along with relatively not that large list of shocks which are supposed to be uncontroversial and which should be accounted within the model. In the most simplest form, the new Keynesian DSG model can be based on the following three equations, which are depicted here. Let me discuss let's discuss them here for a while. The first one is the so-called new Keynesian IS curve, or new Keynesian IS curve. Yes. So it is a positive relation between output and inflation. However, the biggest difference between the old Keynesian and new Keynesian model is that here there is not a relationship between output and current inflation, but with the future inflation at time t plus 1 expected at time t. So you can see that inflation expectations drive here the dynamics a lot. Obviously, the IS curve in principle is very much about the inverse relationship between the interest rate and or real interest rate in particular. So let's denote it as R here. and the output. So it should be negatively sloped. Let's go ahead. So let's mark this as IS. So the real interest rate is here the difference between interest rate and expected inflation. And besides that, the current output is also driven by the expected output in the future. So again, expectations are here. The second equation is the new Keynesian Phillips curve. So Phillips curve has returned into the mainstream macroeconomic models with the new Keynesian Macroeconomics, and here it mainly serves as a description of the dynamics of inflation, and it represents here the link between the inflation, which is associated with monetary policy and with the nominal sector, with the real economy, which is here expressed as a difference between actual output and potential output, denoted as Y bar. The small letters overall here represent the logarithms. So it's so the difference between YT and YT bar is the output gap in percents. And here the new Keynesian Phillips curve is not only about positive association between output and between output gap and inflation. There is again room for inflation expectations. So by this, the new Keynesian Phillips curve addresses the criticism of the Phillips curve from the new classical macroeconomics of the 1970s, and it also incorporates and is based on similar ideas as the monetary cycle models, in which inflation expectations drive the dynamics. Now it is now the new Keynesian Phillips curve is being derived from micro foundations as well, and lead to such a relationship. And the final so a lot of new Keynesian Phillips curve again. So here we have output, here we have inflation, and it's upward sloping output gap. That means that positive output gap is associated with higher price level or higher inflation. In fact, the new Keynesian Phillips curve represents the aggregate supply in the model. And finally, there is a third equation, which is called monetary policy rule, and which links the nominal interest rate with the development of inflation. So here's the difference between inflation and inflation target, denoted as P bar. The inflation PT can be here either as actual inflation, or what happens very often as an expected inflation, again, and it is then linked to the to the output gap again. R is here the real interest rate, and inflation is here again once more, so that the nominal interest rate should correspond to a sum of real interest rate and inflation. And this monetary policy rule sets that that if there is some deviation between inflation and inflation target, then the monetary policy shall react to this difference by raising the nominal interest rate. And similarly, if there is some output gap, either positive or negative, the monetary policymakers shall adjust the policy rate. There is also another term here, lack of the nominal interest rate. This term is here to represent the idea that central bank usually tries not to surprise the markets with immediate sharp cuts of interest rates, even though this has changed a little bit over the past years. But for a long time it's been practiced to adjust the interest rates rather gradually. So that's why here the dependence of the interest rate on the past interest rate is being included. And then we can include a new line here, And instead of having ISLM plot, we have ISMP plot. The implications of the in terms of for the fiscal and monetary policy are relatively similar to the baseline ISLM model. The main difference is here, however, in expectations. Furthermore, the other difference is that the model is derived from micro foundations, and the other difference is that here the model explicitly accounts for several shocks. Here, there is aggregate demand shock explicitly, so the dynamic simulations are possible. Here is aggregate supply shock, so supply shocks are here quite well and explicitly represented. And finally, here is a monetary policy shock. That means that the central bank just is allowed to change and to affect the behavior by some unexpected change in their monetary policy stance. The implications of those new Keynesian DSG models, well, the three equations can be extended in various forms. The first extension, which often appears, is that the main that while we have that the autoregressive terms are added not only to the third equation but also to the first one and to the second one. That means that the output is to depend not only on current output and expected output, not only on expected output, but on past output as well. So there is a bit higher persistence. And similarly, the inflation is allowed to depend at least a little bit also to past inflation realizations as well. So a bit more hybrid form arises. Anyway, the implications of those models are the following. First, monetary policy now has real effects in the short term due to sticky prices. The central role in the model have inflation expectations via the new Keynesian Phillips curve, so that the current inflation is driven either solely or mainly via expected inflation and output gap and the current output gap. It has profound implication because if the inflation is really driven by current output gap and expected inflation, then via manipulating the expectations about the inflation, we can achieve disinflation and stable inflation without increasing without widening the output gap and without increasing the unemployment. So here, because of the expectations, the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation doesn't have to arise if the inflation expectations are decreased via, for example, communication of the policy or via good monetary policy that is credible. And if everybody expects that the inflation will be low in the future, then the unemployment stopped to be negatively affected by this change of these expectations. What also leads as an implication of the new Keynesian DSG model is a so-called divine coincidence. The divine coincidence as a result of optimization of the new Keynesian DSG model, which implies that stabilization of inflation actually stabilizes the output and the employment as well. Although Ganjar and Gali have shown that the assumption of this divine coincidence are relatively restrictive, still the implication of the DSG model that stabilization of inflation might bring stabilization of output and employment as well was widely accepted, especially by central bankers, because it provided a theoretical justification for the primary role of monetary policy. And it also provided a justification why monetary policy should be delegated on independent central banks which focus mainly on achieving of inflation target, because it's been believed that if you achieve stable inflation via, for example, inflation targeting, you also achieve stabilization of the policy. Furthermore, as an additional implication, what comes out of this model is that the discretionary fiscal policy shall be rather avoided. Let me say also a few words about the financial markets, about the role of financial markets and financial instability in the new Keynesian macroeconomic models, because the financial instability is often considered as, or the omission of a potential risk of financial instability is often considered as one of the main failures of the new Keynesian DSG models, because economists are relying on those models were unable to predict the great recession starting in 2008. So, well, how is it with financial markets in the Keynesian macroeconomics? I already stated that one of the building block of the new Keynesian macroeconomics is that financial markets are supposed to be efficient. And this efficiency of financial markets means that or are represented by a so-called efficient market hypothesis by Ocean Pharma. And this hypothesis states that if we assume that the agents on financial markets are rational, then all prices on the market reflect all available information about future probability. Therefore, if it shouldn't be possible to beat the market consistently, because prices are supposed to react only to new information. And here, we can just say that with efficient market hypothesis, Friedrich August von Hayek beats John Maynard Keynes and Hyman Minsky, who with a completely different perspective of financial markets. Keynes was famous for his animal spirits, Hyman Minsky then for financial stability hypothesis. Both authors, Keynes and Minsky, what do they have in common is that they did not believe that that markets are rational and that they are able to consistently price the assets well, and that they just attributed a tendency to create bubbles to financial markets. If you have a look at the efficient markets hypothesis, then the bubbles are excluded almost by assumption, because it is believed that rational agents just do not allow for bubbles in their self-interest. Moreover, the formulations of the efficient market hypothesis implied that the market was able to price not only the underlying asset, but also the associated risk appropriately. So that's another argument why, or that's another reason why, according to efficient market hypothesis, there shouldn't be any bubbles on the markets, and that the participants on financial markets just do optimal decision by themselves. Therefore, the efficient market hypothesis implies that no regulation is needed, because why would you regulate besides punishing the explicit frauds or stuff like that? Why should we regulate those who behave optimally in their self-interest? So what's also one of the features of the new Keynesian macroeconomics, especially of the main of the pre-crisis consensus before the Great Recession, was that there has been only a weak link between finance and macroeconomy. The financial crises were assumed to be very rare events, merely consequences of policy failures, such as overvalued exchange rates in emerging markets, and the macroeconomic costs associated with those crises were believed to be temporary, and that there could be resolved by adjustment of the economic policy towards best practices. It wasn't even assumed that large financial crises can have detrimental and persistent effects on economic activity, even though the models with financial frictions and with financial market imperfections have been developed even within the new Keynesian even within the framework of new Keynesian DSG models already in the late 1990s. However, these models were not assumed to be important, and these aspects were left behind from most of macroeconomic models that were used at that time. Anyway, the developments of the new Keynesian macroeconomics models were widely accepted by economists and also in the central banks and elsewhere. Over the 1990s and 2000s, therefore, a broad convergence among researchers in academia, central banks, and also in other institutions on a general framework for conducting economic analysis of policy and on forecasting has appeared. So everybody converged, or almost everybody converged to new Keynesian DSG models in those institutions. These models were more popular than even empirical approaches, despite the relatively fast and rapid advances in econometrics and time series econometrics. The DSG models were theoretical, and therefore they were preferred by large and are by some part of the community still largely preferred over the other approaches. What facilitated this convergence was the very flexible methodology. On one hand, the methodology of DSG models accepted the methodological novelties and innovations of the 1970s. So there were a few reasons to reject the methodology by the proponents of the new classical macroeconomics. And also the flexibility allowed to many researchers to accommodate divergent views and contributed to robustness of the main theoretical framework against the attacks also after the Great Recession. Everyone just could say, okay, let's improve the structure of the model, let's include different blocks, and we can use the same models again.